have because a very distinguished speaker, the likes of which we don't get to hear very often in our meetings. So I'll introduce him in a minute, and then we'll have him give his talk. But I want to say that this series is part of a series of talks hosted by the Displacement Action and Research Network, a group of students and faculty at MIT who are trying to understand the increasing instances of displacement and challenges to housing and land rights, particularly disproportionately affect the world's poor, and about which, in fact, social scientists know very little, and policymakers do very little. Because we really don't know who gets evicted, where, and don't know what happens to them when they get evicted, and we don't know how they cope with their mechanisms. We understand very little about those mechanisms. And the policies that are in place are based on hunches about what people are doing rather than an empirical or rigorous understanding of what actually goes on. And to sort of redress that in some ways. And NGOs and movements of people affected themselves, they lurch from crisis to crisis, from issue to issue, and they're not the ones to think back and reflect on what connects me from what I'm going through, from what those people are going through, or just a few hundred miles away who are going through a similar process of displacement. And here, when we say displacement, we have a larger phenomenon than simply evictions in mind. Evictions is part of displacement, but when we talk about development-induced displacement, we're talking about many causes of displacement, including displacement caused by floods and climate change and so-called quote-unquote natural disasters, like Haiti. So how natural was that? So we have to get into many of that. And what we have done is that we've partnered with some high-powered people, one of whom is right here with us in this room. And essentially, I'll say that this project has three different elements to it. One is, of course, drawing on the strength from MIT faculty and students from many departments, because it's a very interdisciplinary project. We have faculty from our school, urban studies and planning, architecture involved, and I see mostly students from there, but those of you who are not from that school, let me say, I'm speaking as though everybody here knows me, but I'm faculty in urban studies and planning. Besides the faculty and students from that department and school, we also have people from political science and other social science departments who are collaborating with us. And we want to look at three broad areas. One is the global commodification of land and natural resources, and the exclusion of increasing exclusion of poor communities from land, and the coping strategies that they have, and how that relates to broader economic development challenges. On this, we are collaborating with Professor Olivier Schutter, who is the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food, who's also a professor at Université Catholique de Lyon in Belgium. We have research ongoing on this theme already, and we'll have a special symposium on this at dusk in the fall, and a symposium in Belgium in the spring, and hope to bring out a volume on that. The second component relates to land rights in peace building, specifically has an African focus, but essentially looks at land and conflict, but conflict not in a non-conflict, full-blown war sense, but everyday conflicts, and look at, with a particular attention to elements of ethnicity, gender, so the mechanisms or the frameworks of exclusion. And specifically here, we want to draw on the work done by the UN Special Rapporteur on internally displacement, Chaloka Bayani, who's a Zambian academic, teaches at London School of Economics. And his office has developed very influential guidelines for internally displaced people and their rights from the late 90s, when Francis Deng, the former Sudanese diplomat, was holding their office, and there are many African institutions with which we are establishing networks which will help us carry out the research and make this network more effective in this area. The third component involves the right to the city and urban displacement, specifically looking at the globalization of eminent domain as an important development and its relationship to human rights. This is the project that we're doing, the question of urban displacement with Miloon Kothari, who's here with us. He's a trained architect and urban planner who practiced for, as I just learned today, 10 years in New York City, doing some very interesting things, including landscape architect work that was transforming the Bronx Zoo. So, very interesting sort of work he has in the background. Before he migrated, earlier life, before he migrated to more direct work on human rights, especially as he moved back to India. He has been a former UN Special Rapporteur on the right to housing. He held the mandate for 8 years. Now, this is a global office appointed by the governors of the world through the UN Human Rights Council. They have to vote on it and appoint. And these people are held, they hold their offices in an independent capacity. They may be professors or experts. In Miloon's case, the leader of a major global NGO. But they work in their individual capacity. They don't owe any affiliation to anybody. And they have fixed mandates. And they have a global investigation role where they can visit countries around the world on their invitation to go and investigate the extent to which these countries are actually able to protect the housing rights of populations without discrimination in their countries. And during his 8-year mandate, he has traveled to no less than 13 countries, which is phenomenal if you think about it, the number of trips in a year, and issued some very influential reports. And one of the things that he did was, in addition to the country reports, which were very influential, he has also developed a basic principles on development-induced displacement, on how to deal with evictions, and he has developed some very influential toolkits for eviction assessment impact, which are increasingly being used by NGOs and by governments around the world. And this set of activities are going to be showcased in many different ways by Miloon. One through this talk today, which is titled Towards a Better Urban Agenda, Development without Displacement. And tomorrow he has a training workshop, which is more on Thursday. Yes, 21st. There's a training workshop from 6 to 7:30 on NGO evaluation and displacement monitoring, specifically drawing on the way NGOs approach social impact analysis and methodologies, and particularly describing the tools that they develop, as I said. That was tomorrow, 21st. I guess I just noticed. Then on Monday, he's giving a talk on specifically focused on India's urban transformation at the Center for International Studies. So all the information about the program is actually on the same email that you received, which tells you about this event. So without further ado, let me just say that Miloon, in addition to his role earlier as architect and urban planner and former UN Special Rapporteur on the right to housing, he has also been one of the world's leading experts on housing and land issues, who everybody wants to consult. And he's also now the executive director of South Asia for Housing and Land Rights Network, a global network affiliated with the Habitat International Coalition. He's a convener of the Working Group on Human Rights in India and the UN. It's a very politically important group in the Indian context. And if you want to get a sample of the work that they're doing in HLRN, some of the reports produced by the NGO are displayed over there. You can log into this website and get copies of these reports. There are many reports, including, there are some reports out there on Commonwealth Games, but recently they've done a report on the Olympics as well. How many games did you look at? Right, several games. So there are some really interesting stuff out there done by his NGO as well. So without further ado, here's Miloon.
Thanks very much. It's great to be here. It's a difficult topic, depressing topic, but we try to make some sense of the impact of evictions and what is the response at the national level, at the global level. But I thought, a good way to begin just to situate us in terms of the severity of the problem. We could watch a video, a short video, of 10 minutes, which tries to capture what happens when people are evicted and, in conversations with affected people. So if we could start with that, it's okay with everyone.
It's like a war zone. It's like somebody dropped a bomb and just boom, dispersed everybody.
Entra presidente, sai presidente. E os pobres continuam na mesma ladainha.
Hablan de los megaproyectos que traen desarrollo. Queremos decirles que hemos ido a diferentes países en busca de la base de desarrollo y esa base no existe.
Forced evictions are when people are forcibly moved from their home, from their land, from their community, from their neighborhood, from their culture, against their will or desire. For projects that often have no benefit to the communities that are being evicted.
Forced eviction normally is done by companies, private companies, with the assistance of the local authority or the government. They evict people from their original place without fair compensation and using force, using violence.
The groups that lack economic or political power are the ones that would most often be susceptible to forced eviction.
Nenhum desenvolvimento pode violar direitos humanos. Então, tem que ser questionado como se pode equalizar grandes obras, o que as pessoas acreditam como desenvolvimento e a melhoria das condições de vida das pessoas.
I understand that the duty of obligation of the government is to develop the country. But develop the country is not develop the country for the sake, for the benefit of only a small amount of people. The rich become more richer and the poor become poorer.
How can any project that leads to further impoverishment of the communities, removing them from their livelihood sources, be called development?
الحقيقة التنمية كلمة أصبحت مخيفة لمعظم الناس لأن باسمها كثير من الجرائم ترتكب حق كثير من الناس.
Wherever eviction takes place, there's a pattern of violations that we can see very clearly. Before an eviction, communities often aren't consulted about the projects. They receive no information about what's happening, and there's often intimidation, harassment, threats, and even physical violence pressuring these communities to accept the projects.
Eles chegam aí quando eles falam, eles não comentam, olha, se não aceitarem uma guerradora, por exemplo, agora, vai vir um trator e passar por cima.
Que ustedes no han de respetar nuestros derechos humanos ni como mexicanos ni como ciudadanos ni como seres humanos. Porque después de nunca forma hacer la consulta comunitaria si estamos de acuerdo o no a ser inundados o a ser ubicados.
كنا قاعدين فيها والحمد لله يعني وكان كل شيء يقولوا هتتشال مش هتتشال. المهم ما حدش ولا انظرنا بإدارة ولا انظرنا بأي حاجة خالص.
Amor, tiro na raiva da rede, quando eu tiver uma topa, eu me raivo. Quando eu me topa, eu me topa. No malinho me dá tira aberto, no barrio me dá tira.
During the election, the most repeated pattern is use of force and violence, and violation of all sorts of fundamental and human rights that we can possibly imagine.
E normalmente os moradores estão em estado de choque. Algumas vezes a casa foi destruída com os pertences dentro, quer dizer, os moradores além de perderem a casa, perderam seus pertences. Então é um processo em geral violento.
You evict people from the place that they're living for a long time, and they were brought to another place far away from the first one. And the new place, most of the new place had no job, no electricity, no running water, no market, no school for the children, no medical care close to that. So it's really very bad for the people.
After a forced eviction, families are often left to fend for themselves. They have no place to go. When there is a resettlement option, it's often inadequate. And the main thing we see with communities that go through forced eviction is that they're left in a worse off condition than they were before the eviction.
Como aqui foi tratado igual a lixo. Aqui tinha 150 moradias e comércio. Não deu nenhum tipo de indenização pra gente, os comerciantes não receberam nada.
क्योंकि अभी हम लोग इधर 6 साल हो गया, अभी इधर से हम लोग दूसरा जगह जाएंगे, उधर से भी यही होएगा, हम लोग उधर से भी यही ऐसे ही बताएंगे.
A gente encontra um processo de resistência através de petições, de reuniões, negociações com o poder público, de manifestações, atos públicos.
فأهم ميزة في المقاومة هي التضامن الناس مع بعض وفي وقفة واحدة بدل ما بنتعرض لخناقات خاصة واحنا ساكتين ومجرد ضحايا. السلطات أيا كانت السلطات في أي دولة ما تقدرش تقف قدام ناس بحجم كبير وأعداد كبيرة.
For years, all of these actions have helped communities facing forced evictions learn from each other and build upon each other locally and internationally. And through this, they've not only claimed, but they've also gained a larger stake in deciding what kind of development actually benefits them.
Nâng có ở vay vay phên phết đa dạng cùng nhiều của đa số cái cá to số một cái đóng đầu dưới tử phố đào phấn cả lớn sân rồi.
Uma comunidade de baixa renda no Rio tem projeto popular de urbanização. Enquanto o governo está oferecendo a remoção daquela comunidade, eles oferecem a urbanização.
Nosotros los comuneros salimos a la calle y salimos a la defensa porque nos quieren quitar nuestra tierra y nos damos el riesgo pagayo. Y nosotros no estamos de acuerdo en eso.
Out of 10 eviction cases that we've challenged court, we've won the one. With that, we have gained the dignity of the poor people. We cannot just come and keep every people, but we need to follow proper channels of eviction.
I
comunidades que todavía no tienen la conciencia que efectivamente su situación no es una situación singular, no es una situación exclusivamente de su localidad, sino que es una situación compartida. Entonces, seguramente es necesario buscar relacionar la problemática local con la problemática, digamos, más general, más internacional.
You have South Korean company investing in India. You have Indian company investing in South Africa. If the nature of that transaction in the finance and the people causing these evictions are international in nature, then the campaigns ought to be international in nature. We are in a globalized world, and we ought to have campaigns that are global. We have no choice.
States must incorporate a new approach which places citizens and the communities at the center of decision making.
People need to come before profits. Real development should improve the lives of families and not tear these lives apart.
Colocar o interesse das pessoas antes de qualquer interesse econômico, de grandes projetos. Então, esses projetos servem para quê?
What is very disturbing about what you saw is that you see different places and it's happening all over the world. But one of the most disturbing aspects of this phenomenon is its pervasiveness and, in a sense, its belligerence. It's just happening everywhere. Evictions are taking place in democratic countries, authoritarian states. And many of these evictions are justified under the pretext of serving the public good. The excuse often used by governments is that we are clearing these areas, demolishing slums with a public purpose. We need this land for other use. And there's no evidence to really show that the other use, that many of these places that are emptied by these evictions is really for a public purpose. So when we speak about development-based evictions, what are we talking about? We're talking about kind of slum clearance drives that you saw in the video, large-scale infrastructure projects, land acquisition measures associated with urban renewal, housing renovation, city beautification, what goes in the name of city beautification. And in the last 15 years or so, evictions have are also occurring around the world due to the reluctance of states to control speculation in housing and in property. This is something that is very, very prevalent in the northern countries as well. And figures, I mean, whatever data is available, and I'll come back to this question on the data, show that there are millions of people displaced, forced into homelessness and inadequate insecure housing every year in development projects. One very striking figure from my country, India, is that since independence, since 1947, about 60 million people have been displaced. So that's about 1 million every year. only due to development projects. This is an astonishing figure. And another very striking figure that we came up with when I was doing our work with the UN Special Rapporteur is that if you put all the numbers of people being displaced around the world because of support development projects, it exceeds the number of people who are displaced annually because of armed and conflict. So just think about that. That's really a lot of people. We're talking about, I'll give you some figures. But what we really need to remember, and you saw this just now, is that the impact is nothing short of human tragedy. People are left homeless and destitute. Cities which have had major eviction drives, there's been a dramatic increase in the number of people who are homeless on the streets directly as a result of that. They are left without a means of earning a livelihood. They have no effective access to legal or other remedies. And of course, evictions affect the poorest, socially and economically most vulnerable and marginalized sections of society. And most disturbingly, they intensify inequality and social conflict, to contribute to segregation, and to what we are now seeing increasingly around the world, the creation of what can be termed as apartheid cities, where entire areas of cities are cleared from poor to evictions. And again, strikingly, if you look even in a democratic country like India, where I'm from, these people who are evicted, whether they were evicted from a large dam in the rural areas, they were forced to come to the city, or they were evicted, they have been living in the city for decades, they have been evicted because of the riverside beautification or other infrastructure projects. They have less rights than refugees have. So today we have a situation where an Afghan refugee coming in to be Delhi has more rights than an Indian citizen who was displaced from somewhere who was forced to come into the city. So you have this kind of, which actually raises a lot of questions about citizenship, raises a lot of questions about constitutional rights that people have to move and settle wherever in the country. So I'll just give you some examples. These are drawn from what has happened in the last 10 years, just to give you the idea of the scale of the event, scale of the phenomenon. In 2005, I think you may all have heard of Operation Balakrishnan in Zimbabwe. One single operation led to the eviction of 700,000 people in a very short time. Since late 2004 until now, if you look at the figures from the city of Mumbai, 400,000 people have been evicted from their homes. And a lot of this is done in the name of planning. It's done in the name of large infrastructure projects, projects that are given very names that are the project in Mumbai that I'm speaking about, an urban renewal initiative is called Operation Makeover. And the idea was to free public spaces for infrastructure projects, including commercial and entertainment center. These kind of mass evictions are unfortunately declining around the world. We don't see these numbers right now, but what has replaced that are incremental evictions. So evictions continue to happen, and actually when you compute the figures, and I'll come back to this question of what kind of figures do we have really, it's still a very, very large number of people who are being evicted. If you look at Nigeria, for example, in Abuja, the federal capital territory of Nigeria, there have been mass evictions since 2003, 2004, and they've displaced about 800,000 people. The city authorities justify these evictions as an implementation, belated implementation of the Abuja Master Plan of 1979, which included planned measures for beautification of the federal capital city. And in implementing this master plan, the authorities nullified allocation documents and title deeds that had been issued by former authorities, and of course contributed to a different type of real estate development. in Mexico, large dams have caused devastating levels of displacement. One project alone displaced about 25,000 people. Raj was earlier referring to the Commonwealth Games in Delhi, city where I live. Our figures show that something like 200,000 people have been evicted in a 4-year period before the Commonwealth Games in preparation for the Games. And unlike the example that I was giving about Abuja, where there was a systematic implementation of a very ill-advised master plan, in Delhi actually the evictions made a mockery of the master plan that existed. It completely bypassed the planning process and changed land use to suit the creation of transport corridors for the games where people could access the stadiums, and created a situation where planners actually, and this is becoming more and more common around the world, planners are actually running after the events. They're not leading the process in any sense. Other priorities take over, and then the planners have to quickly adjust the plan to the master plan and then move on. But this raises a lot of different issues. I'll give you one more example. The North Rail and South Rail project in Philippines, which has been going on for some time and completed, we have evicted for 150,000 people. And you're all familiar with the evictions here in the United States of the demolition of large-scale demolitions of public housing in Chicago and other cities. I don't know the numbers, how many people have been evicted. In Canada, I did a mission there when I was working as rapporteur, and many testimonies that we could show that thousands of households were evicted because high rents, inadequate income support, without proper hearings, and no consideration whatsoever that these evictions were going to be homelessness. So there's a very basic question there. And I can give you many more examples, but what is important for us to note, again, as you saw in the video, is that many of these development-based evictions have one or several common features that contravene existing human rights standards. Lack of prior notice. Very often evictions take place just without any notice at all. Very often they take place at night, during festivals, during examinations of the children, school examinations. Second common feature is that inadequate or no consultation. No consultation with the community that there is a need to clear this area, and we discussed that. Complete absence of information sharing. No participation for the communities in decision-making processes for those that are affected. A lack of housing alternatives. So there's no search for alternatives to say, let's think about this. Do we really need to evict this now? Is there an alternative to that? Use of excessive force and violence. And without there being human rights commitment, these do have devastating consequences. And the situation has become so severe that even governments are so keen on clearing areas of cities that they even make cynical use of global goals. You may have heard of the Millennium Development Goal of reducing by 2015, I think, the number of people living in slums by half around the world. We have examples now of a number of cities under the Cities Without Slums program actually evicting people and then saying, yes, we have reduced the numbers. So there is and the other common feature, which is very important from a perspective of understanding the enormity of the crisis and trying to find solutions, is that discrimination plays a very critical role in post-evictions cases. So ethnic, religious, racial, other minorities, indigenous people are more likely than others to be evicted. So they're disproportionately affected. Women suffer particularly as a result of post-evictions and as a consequence not just of loss of the home, but also livelihoods, relationships, support systems that they're used to. Break down kinship ties, physical, psychological trauma, and statistics show that even in And we have to also remember that all this is happening in what is an already existing adverse global situation. UN figures show that we have 100 million people homeless around the world. We have 1.6 billion people who are inadequately housed. So on top of that, now we are having these type of evictions. And these are rough figures. I don't think anyone can say that. I mean, they capture the housing crisis, the housing crisis. We cannot say that they're accurate. So there's one of the problems we face, and this is where planners can make a difference, research people can make a difference, academics can make a difference. So there's a serious lack of assessment of the scale of the problem. How many people are evicted every year? Who are the people that are evicted? There's very little disaggregated data. There's a lot of, there are a lot of studies done by NGOs and others, but we don't have a global system of assessing. So it then becomes also difficult not having that data to propose solutions. But that's not an excuse for governments. They should be collecting that data. They're not doing that. And so we have a situation where the rights are being violated. We have a situation where this is happening across the world. Even though, as I mentioned, mass evictions are on the decline. If you look at sheer numbers, you don't see really a reduction because of the incremental nature of the evictions now. So what are people doing? Speak for a few minutes about what is the response. So there is a response, there's a vigorous response at national levels. We see an increasing number of campaigns and movements around the world that are struggling against large dams. We have very large campaigns in India, in Brazil, in Mexico. We have an amazing group called Not There, which is a coalition of many of the people who are directly affected by either dams, displaced people, or are threatening to displace people. We have campaigns against mining, campaigns against mega plants. There's a steel plant that's being planned in the state of Orissa in India called POSCO, the South Korean company. And there's a huge campaign in the country led by the villagers themselves, but now also with international support. There are many campaigns against urban displacement, against land grabbing. And there are transnational alliances which are on either single projects, and some of these campaigns and alliances have actually been able to stop projects. We have a number of large-scale mega projects that have been stopped in India. And also we have transnational alliances on thematic issues. So there are campaigns against large dams. There are campaigns against mega events. So, in Rio, for example, evictions have already begun in planning for the World Cup and the Olympics. But there's a very active exchange going on between cities like Delhi and others who have already had mega events to exchange strategies on countering these types of evictions. And there are a number of international NGOs that are very actively working. I mentioned Habitat International, Amnesty is taking up more and more work on Amnesty International on evictions. And there are responses at the formal level as well, we can call it that. If you look recently at the constitutions of different countries, for the first time we are seeing an explicit reference to evictions. The South African constitution on Article 1 evictions, the draft constitutions of Nepal and Kenya have a reference on Article 1 against evictions. And increasingly courts are intervening, so we have cases from India, from Kenya, that are, actually courts, judgments saying that eviction should not happen, and what is the alternative. At the international level, the UN has been working on this for quite some time now. Beginning in 1993, the UN Commission on Human Rights, which is the highest policy-making body on human rights, governmental body at the UN, adopted quite a remarkable resolution on forced evictions, where it said that forced evictions are a gross violation of human rights. then the UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights did a general comment and interpretive instrument on post-eviction, where they stated that eviction should only happen in exceptional circumstances. And then when I started my work as rapporteur, I obviously had to take, I took a very particular interest in this because my mandate was on the right to housing, and so one of the most pervasive violations of that right are post-evictions. So I prepared a thematic report in 2004, and over a 4-year period, looking at examples, best practices, responses from around the world, we actually drafted something called the UN Basic Principles and Guidelines on development-based evictions and displacement, which are the operational guidelines on the issue of evictions. And what we did in those guidelines is essentially we also tried to tackle some of the structural reasons why evictions happen. So we said that it's an obligation on governments to confer legal security of tenure on all people who are lacking such protection. Because very often evictions take place and governments say, but these people are illegal, they have no rights. We looked at the need for comprehensive reviews of national legislations. Found in numerous countries where there are national laws that are actually unconstitutional and justify post-eviction, and these need to be challenged. We also looked at the guidelines recommend states that they have to take specific preventative measures to avoid or eliminate underlying causes of evictions, such as speculation in land and real estates, and that there's a very urgent need to review the operation and regulation of housing and tenancy markets, and to intervene in the market situation to reduce speculation so that it does not lead to does not increase the vulnerability of growing populations and lead to their displacement. The guidelines also call for comprehensive and holistic impact assessments. One of the striking features of evictions is that unlike environmental situations where you have an environmental impact assessment before a project is carried out, we don't have anything like that for evictions. So projects are carried out without ever there being an assessment of what is going to be the human impact. So the guidelines actually call for there to be an assessment done prior to any action to actually carry out the eviction. The guidelines call for an exploration of possible alternatives. Again, studies around the world have shown that in most cases where people have been evicted, you could have alternatives, including for large dams. You could reduce reduce displacement or not, there doesn't have to be displacement at all. And the guidelines call for there to be, they very explicitly specify that evictions can only happen in exceptional circumstances. We'll talk about what these exceptional circumstances would be, and all that I won't be breaking out, but all of that being consistent with human rights obligations. And they place the onus on the state, which is not there right now, on the government to demonstrate why the eviction is unavoidable. And they call on, for there to be, as I mentioned, those common features I mentioned, there to be sufficient notice, there to be consultation, there to be prior and informed consent of the community before carrying out evictions. And then the guidelines going to what type of safeguards need to be put in place if evictions are happening, what happens after displacement, what kind of resettlement rights people have, what sort of compensation they should get based on the impact assessment. And currently, and these guidelines, as I also mentioned, are increasingly being used now. They're available in 20 languages. They're being used in court cases. They're being used to frame more locally based guidelines for municipalities on countering evictions, reducing evictions. And now we have moved these guidelines to the UN Human Rights Council in 2007, and now we are working on actually developing the eviction impact assessment tool. How do you actually assess the impact of the type of damages that we saw in the video. How do you understand, how do you look at material impacts, non-material impacts? How do you measure psychological impacts? It's sort of a work in progress. We need more work on this, but there is already an instrument in place. It's been field tested in 7 different situations in different countries. One of the areas was an eviction that took place, again, I live in Delhi, in a place called Balakrishnan, and we carried out an extensive eviction impact assessment. And the findings are, very, very useful. The findings, I'll just summarize for you. The finding was that the average family that was evicted because of that demolition, they lost, at a minimum, they suffered loss of access to housing, including the loss of documentation. That supported the fact that they had tenant security. There was significant reductions in access to livelihood activities and loss of wages. Substantial reductions in monthly spending on food. Substantial increase in expenses related to procuring water in the place which they were evicted. A substantial rise in injuries and expenses related to health, both as a direct result of demolition and its aftermath, as well as the exacerbation and creation of chronic health conditions from demolitions. Loss of education for children, and the destruction of numerous assets and possessions. This study was then been presented in a case that's going on in the Delhi High Court to support the call to end the eviction, or the eviction, and to give adequate compensation. So this is the work that is going on right now, and obviously, we can try to tackle evictions where they happen. We can try to push for policies, but what is really needed is a very much a radical shift in the paradigm in which we think about cities, the way in which we plan and think about cities. And I wanted to just spend a few minutes on what I find to be a very valuable and useful way forward, which is the right of the city approach. I think some of you may know what this is. This is an idea that's been there for some time. Essentially, just in very simple terms, what it means is that everyone who contributes to the city with their labor should have a right to what the city has to offer. Simply that. But if we go further and deeper into this idea of the right to the city, it essentially calls for a city, in Delhi we call it, let's move towards a caring city. But it calls for a city that would be based on mutual respect, tolerance, democracy, social justice, which would incorporate very basic principles of human rights, the indivisibility of human rights, that all rights have to be realized. We cannot pick rights and implement them. And that there has to be an equal priority in city governance and planning, management, and implementation of a range of different rights, adequate standard of living, access to water, health, food, security of the person, and home, freedom from inhuman and degrading treatment. And also the recognition that rights are not only individual, but there is a collective dimension that, as we can see, the eviction very often affect entire communities and entire groups of people. The second principle on the right of the city, which is very important for us to move forward, is of non-discrimination and inclusion, and that all people have the right to the city. And inclusiveness, we very often hear this word, but in this context it refers to the adoption of inclusive models of city planning and development, as well as the creation and sustenance of mixed income and mixed class neighborhoods to prevent social segregation, gentrification, and social apartheid, and the increasing ghettoization of city spaces. And it also calls for the poor. This is another emerging trend of criminalization of the poor. So it calls for the fact that poor and homeless must not be criminalized and subjected to forms of abuse and violence by the state and its machinery, and that we need to end anti-vagrancy and anti-beggary laws that they need to be abolished. Then the right to the city approach is based very much on the fundamental tenets of human rights, which is the priority to be given to vulnerable and marginalized groups. It's very odd actually when you look at even planning processes. Planning processes are not based on meeting the rights of the most vulnerable first. I mean, we have one good example now, it's the city statute that's coming today in Brazil, which actually calls on municipalities to designate areas where low-income people live as areas of social interest. So essentially, the first obligation on the municipality once the law came into being was to designate those areas and to provide civic services there and to